In the summer of 1260, a Mongol army stood at the edge of Syria, and the world had learned to fear that sight. They had come from the east, and everywhere they passed, kingdoms fell. Baghdad, the jewel of the Islamic world, had burned just 2 years before. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had endured for 5 centuries, ended in a week of slaughter. The Mongols drove the Caliph's armies into the Tigris until the river ran dark. They pulled down the House of Wisdom, and the books of 1,000 years floated in the water. 70,000 died in the streets, perhaps more. The chroniclers stopped counting. This was not the first time the Mongols had broken an empire that seemed eternal. In 1219, they crossed into Khwarazm, the greatest Muslim power of Central Asia. The Shah had 200,000 men. He had fortresses that controlled the Silk Road. He had wealth that rivaled any kingdom on earth. The Mongols destroyed him in 2 years. They took Bukhara, Samarkand and Urgench. They hunted the Shah across Persia until he died alone, on an island in the Caspian Sea. His son fled to India. His cities never recovered. In 1241, the Mongols shattered the armies of Poland and Hungary in a single week. At Liegnitz, they killed Duke Henry II and wiped out the flower of European chivalry. At Mohi, they annihilated the Hungarian army and chased King Bela IV into the Adriatic. Central Europe lay open. Only the death of the great Khan Ugadai, thousands of miles away in Karakoram, pulled the Mongols back. They withdrew not because they were stopped, but because the succession required it. This was the force that entered Syria in 1260. Not a raiding party, not a punitive expedition. A full Mongol army under Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis, brother to the reigning Great Khan. He had taken Baghdad with deliberate methodical brutality to send a message: resistance was suicide. The Mongols did not negotiate. They did not accept tribute and leave. They conquered, and they stayed, and the only choice they offered was submission or death. Aleppo surrendered in January 1260. Hulagu's general Kitbuqa, a Nestorian Christian with a personal hatred of Muslims, took the city without a siege. The population was spared. The message was clear: open your gates and live. Damascus surrendered in March. The governor fled. The citizens sent out the keys. Kitbuqa rode through the streets with his Christian allies from the Armenian and Georgian kingdoms, and for the first time in 6 centuries, church bells rang in Damascus while mosques stood silent. The Mongols did not impose this. They simply permitted it. They were indifferent to faith. What mattered was power, and in the spring of 1260 all power in the Near East flowed from the Mongol camp. The Crusader states sent delegations. The Prince of Antioch and the King of Armenia had already allied with Hulagu. Now the Franks of Acre and Sidon offered provisions and safe passage. They were not fools. They understood what was happening. A new order was being written, and the smart choice was to be on the winning side before the terms were dictated. To the south, Egypt waited. The Mamluk Sultanate, ruled by a military caste of slave soldiers who had seized power less than a decade before. They had no ancient dynasty, no divine mandate. They were former slaves who had killed their masters and taken the throne by force. They were tough, professional and pragmatic, but they were new, and they stood alone. Hulagu sent an envoy to Cairo with a letter. The language was blunt. The Mongols had destroyed every army that opposed them. The Caliph was dead. The Shah was dead. The kings of Europe had been crushed. Resistance was pointless. The Mamluks were given a choice: submit or be annihilated like all the others. The Mamluk Sultan was Qutuz, a Turkic officer who had taken the throne just months before in a palace coup. He was not a diplomat. He was a general, and he knew what submission meant. It meant the end of the Mamluk state, the end of his power, and likely the end of his life. The Mongols did not tolerate rivals. Qutuz called a council. Some of his emirs argued for negotiation. The Mongols could not be beaten. History proved it. The smart move was to accept vassal status, pay tribute, and survive. Qutuz rejected this. He understood that the Mongols did not leave vassals in place when it suited them to conquer. Baghdad had been given terms too. Submission bought time, but not safety. He made a decision that, by all precedent, should have been his last. He killed Hulagu's envoys. He took their heads and mounted them on the gates of Cairo. It was a declaration. Egypt would fight. The Mongols did not forgive insults. They did not accept defiance. Every kingdom that had tried to resist them had been erased. The Mamluks were outnumbered, surrounded. and facing an enemy that had never lost. But here is the thing they didn't know yet. The war that was about to begin would not be decided by courage, or by faith, or by the will of generals. It would be decided by something far more mundane, something the Mongols had always controlled and the Mamluks had just begun to understand: the practical structure of war itself. To understand why the Mamluks chose to fight, you have to go back 13 years to a catastrophe they had not forgotten. In 1247, the Khwarezmian Turks, remnants of the empire the Mongols had destroyed, swept into Syria as landless mercenaries. They were desperate, savage, and effective. The Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem hired them, then lost control of them. In October 1244, the Khwarezmians stormed Jerusalem, sacked the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and slaughtered the Christian population. The Frankish states, outraged and terrified, assembled the largest coalition army they had fielded in decades. They marched with the forces of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitaller, and the troops of the allied Syrian Emirates. 16,000 men in total. They met the Khwarezmians and their Egyptian allies at Laforbi near Gaza in October 1244. The battle was a slaughter. The Egyptian Mamluks, fighting as vassals of the Ayyubid Sultan, smashed the Crusader army in a single afternoon. 5,000 Franks died. 800 were captured. The military orders were gutted. The Templars lost 300 knights. The Hospitallers lost 324. It was the worst Crusader defeat since the Battle of Hattin in 1187, and it broke Frankish power in the Levant for a generation. The Mamluks learned something that day. They learned they could beat the best heavy cavalry in the world. They learned that disciplined horse archers, coordinated manoeuvre, and relentless aggression could shatter a Western army, no matter how famous or well-armoured. The commanders who won at Laforbi were still alive in 1260. Some of them were standing in Qutuz's council chamber when the Mongol envoys arrived. They had fought before and they had won before, but the Mongols were not crusaders. The Mongol military system was not like anything the Islamic world had faced. It was not built around aristocratic heavy cavalry, or feudal levies, or tribal warriors who fought for loot and glory. It was a professional, centrally commanded, strategically coordinated war machine that operated across thousands of miles with terrifying efficiency. Every Mongol warrior was a horse archer, trained from childhood. They could shoot accurately at full gallop. They carried multiple bows, 60 arrows, and remounts so they never had to stop. They lived on dried meat and mare's milk and could march for days without resupply. Their mobility was absolute. Armies that tried to chase them found nothing. Armies that tried to stand and fight were surrounded. Mongol generals used scouts, intelligence networks, and deliberate deception. They feigned retreats to draw enemies out of position. They divided forces to envelop from multiple directions. They avoided frontal assaults unless the enemy was already broken. When they did attack, they attacked with overwhelming mass at a single point, smashing through and collapsing the line from inside. They used siege engines crewed by Chinese and Persian engineers. They took cities that had resisted for centuries. They adapted. When they fought in forests or mountains where cavalry was less effective, they used infantry. When they faced heavily armoured knights, they used feigned retreats and arrow storms to exhaust and isolate them. They learned from every campaign and applied those lessons in the next, and they were cruel with purpose. The massacres were not rage, they were policy. Surrender early and you lived. Resist and you died, and your city was levelled so thoroughly that it served as a warning for the next 100 miles. It worked. By 1260, most cities opened their gates the moment the Mongol vanguard appeared. Hulagu's army in Syria was smaller than the forces that had destroyed Khwarezm or invaded Europe. He had perhaps 20,000 Mongol cavalry, supported by Armenian and Georgian Christian auxiliaries, Turkic allies, and local vassals. But even at reduced strength, no one had stopped them. And then, in the early summer of 1260, something changed. Hulagu received word from Karakorum. His brother Mamluk Khan, the Great Khan, was dead. Mamluk had been campaigning in China, besieging a fortress in Sichuan when he died, probably from dysentery, though some sources say a Chinese arrow. His death opened a succession crisis. Hulagu's younger brother Kublai was in the east. Another brother, Erik Bukhe, was in Mongolia. Both claimed the throne. Hulagu had to decide: stay in Syria with the full army, or return east to influence the succession and protect his interests. He chose compromise. He took the bulk of the Mongol army and withdrew back across the Euphrates into Persia, leaving his general Kitbuqa with a reduced force to hold Syria. Kitbuqa remained with perhaps 10 to 12,000 men, mostly Mongol cavalry, supported by local auxiliaries. It was still a formidable force. It had taken Damascus without a fight. But it was no longer the overwhelming tide that had drowned Baghdad. The Mamluks saw the opening. Qutuz did not move immediately. He was too experienced for that. The Mongols were still dangerous, and a reckless attack into Syria would be suicide. Instead, he did something that revealed the cold practicality of the Mamluk state. He sent envoys to the Crusader kingdom of Acre. The request was simple: allow the Mamluk army to cross through Crusader territory unmolested. Resupply them if possible. Do not interfere. In exchange, Egypt would not attack Frankish holdings. The Franks debated. Some argued for neutrality. Others wanted to support the Mongols, who had been tolerant of Christians. But the Prince of Acre made the critical decision. He granted passage. He may have calculated that a Mongol-Mamluk war would weaken both and benefit the Crusaders in the long run. He may have feared that refusing the Mamluks would provoke an Egyptian invasion. He may simply have understood that the Mongols, if they won, would not reward Frankish loyalty with real power. In July 1260, the Mamluk army marched out of Egypt. Qutuz commanded. Beside him was Baybars, one of the most capable and ruthless commanders in the Mamluk military. Baybars had been a slave, a soldier, and a kingmaker. He had helped Qutuz seize the throne. He was ambitious, brutal, and brilliant, and he understood exactly what was at stake. The Mamluk force numbered perhaps 15 to 20,000 cavalry, not enough to match the Mongols in open-steppe warfare, but enough to fight if the conditions were right. They moved north along the coast, resupplied at Acre, and entered the Jezreel Valley in northern Palestine. Kitbuqa received reports of the Mamluk advance. He did not retreat. He gathered his forces and moved south to meet them. The Mongols did not fear battle. They had never lost in the field, and Kitbuqa had spent his life winning. On September 3rd, 1260, the two armies met near a place called Ayn Jalut, the spring of Goliath, a green valley with hills and streams not far from Nazareth. The ground was broken enough to limit Mongol mobility, but open enough for cavalry action. It was not ideal for either side, but it would do. The Mamluks had chosen the field deliberately, and they had a plan that did not rely on hope. The Battle of Ayn Jalut began at dawn with a Mongol charge, and for the first time in decades, it did not break the enemy. Kitbuqa had divided his force into the standard Mongol formation, a centre, two wings, and a reserve. The centre advanced first, horse archers loosing volleys into the Mamluk lines, then wheeling away to draw them forward. It was the oldest Mongol tactic, the feigned retreat that had destroyed Polish knights at Liegnitz and Hungarian armies at Mohi. The enemy would pursue, lose formation, and be encircled by forces that appeared from the flanks. The Mamluks did not pursue. Baybars commanded the Mamluk vanguard, and he held his position. His men were horse archers too, trained in the same steppe tradition as the Mongols. They returned fire. They absorbed the pressure. They did not break formation and chase. When the Mongol centre withdrew, Baybars let them go. Kitbuqa adapted. He committed his wings, trying to envelop the Mamluk flanks and force them into a defensive collapse. The Mamluks countercharged. The fighting became close and chaotic, cavalry clashing at sword range, the missile phase abandoned. This was not the kind of battle the Mongols preferred. They excelled at mobility and manoeuvre, at controlling distance and tempo. In a grinding melee, their advantage narrowed. Qutuz had kept a reserve hidden in the hills. At the critical moment, when the Mongol wings were committed and the centre was reforming, he sent them forward. Fresh cavalry poured into the Mongol flank. The line buckled. Kitbuqa saw the danger. He had two choices: withdraw and regroup, or commit everything and try to smash through before the Mamluk reinforcements turned the battle. He chose aggression. He led the Mongol reserve directly into the Mamluk centre, aiming to kill Qutuz and collapse the command structure. It nearly worked. The Mongols smashed into the Mamluk lines, and for a moment the battle hinged on whether Qutuz's guard could hold. They held, barely. And then the weight of numbers began to tell. The Mamluks had more men on the field now, and they were not running. The Mongol wings started to pull back. Not a rout, but a controlled withdrawal. Kitbuqa tried to rally them, but the momentum had shifted. The Mamluks pressed forward. The Mongol formation broke into fragments, and the withdrawal became a retreat. Kitbuqa was overtaken and killed in the pursuit. Some sources say he fought to the end and refused to surrender, others say he was captured and executed. Either way, the Mongol general was dead and his army was scattered. The Mamluks did not stop. They chased the remnants north, killing stragglers and capturing supply trains. The survivors fled toward Damascus. The Mongols had lost in the field for the first time since the campaigns of Genghis Khan. Word spread quickly. Damascus, which had welcomed Kitbuqa just months before, rose in revolt. The Mongol garrison was massacred in the streets. The Mamluk army entered the city in triumph. Aleppo followed. The Mongol governors fled or died. By the end of September, the Mongols had been driven out of Syria entirely. Qutuz sent envoys to Baghdad and beyond, proclaiming the victory. The Mamluks were hailed as the saviours of Islam. They had done what no one else had done. They had stopped the Mongols. But Qutuz did not live to enjoy the triumph. On the march back to Egypt, Baybars and a group of emirs ambushed him during a hunting trip and killed him. Baybars claimed the throne within days. The official story was that Qutuz had refused to give Baybars the governorship of Aleppo as promised. The real reason was simpler. Baybars wanted power, and he took it. Baybars became Sultan of Egypt, and he ruled for 17 years. He fortified Syria, built a network of fortresses and signal towers, and prepared for the Mongol return. Because Ayn Jalut had not ended the war, it had only stopped the first invasion. The Mongols came back in 1281, under Hulagu's son Kitbuqa. They were defeated again at the Battle of Homs. They returned in 1299 under Ghazan Khan and took Damascus. The Mamluks retook it the following year. The border stabilized along the Euphrates. The Mongol Ilkhanate controlled Persia and Iraq. The Mamluks controlled Egypt and Syria. Neither could destroy the other, but the strategic reality had changed. The Mongols, for all their power, could not hold Syria. The Mamluks, for all their limitations, could defend it. And the reason was not morale, or faith, or the genius of a single commander. It was logistics. Think about that for a moment. The Mongols had conquered the largest land empire in history. They controlled the steppe, the trade routes, the resources of China, Persia, and Central Asia. They moved armies across deserts and mountains with a speed that seemed supernatural, and yet they could not sustain a permanent occupation of Syria. The problem was distance and supply. Syria was at the far edge of Mongol logistics, separated from the Ilkhanate's core territories by the Euphrates and the deserts of northern Iraq. Every campaign required moving men, horses, and supplies across hostile or difficult terrain. The Mongols could raid. They could invade. But holding Syria meant garrisoning cities, controlling roads, and feeding an occupying force in a region that did not produce enough grain to support large cavalry armies. The Mamluks, by contrast, were fighting close to home. Egypt was one of the richest agricultural regions in the world. The Nile flooded every year and deposited fertile silt across the delta. The Mamluks controlled the grain, and grain meant they could feed large standing armies without depending on forage or long supply lines. They could move forces north into Syria and keep them supplied from Egyptian ports and storehouses. When the Mongols invaded, they came with what they could carry. When the Mamluks counterattacked, they came with strategic depth. They could lose a battle and replace their losses. The Mongols, operating at the end of a supply chain that stretched back to Persia, could not. This was the structural factor that changed everything. Not a miracle, not a hero, a question of bread and horseshoes and how far you could march before your army started eating itself. But there was more to it than that, because logistics alone does not win battles, and at Ayn Jalut the Mamluks had not simply outlasted the Mongols, they had outfought them. The Mamluks did not defeat the Mongols by accident. They defeated them because they had spent 15 years building a military system designed for exactly this kind of war. The Mamluk state was born from violence and shaped by necessity. In 1250, the Ayyubid Sultan al-Salih Ayyub died while the Seventh Crusade was besieging Egypt. His wife Shajar al-Dur concealed his death to prevent panic, and the Mamluk generals, the Sultan's slave soldiers, took command. They shattered the Crusader army at the Battle of Al-Mansura in February 1250, captured King Louis IX of France, and ransomed him for 200,000 livres. The Mamluks had saved Egypt, and they knew it. When the Ayyubid heir tried to claim the throne, the Mamluks murdered him and seized power. Shajar al-Dur became sultana for a brief moment, then married the Mamluk commander Aybak, who became sultan. It was a naked military coup, and it worked because the Mamluks controlled the only institution that mattered, the army. The Mamluk military was not feudal. It was professional, centralized, and ruthlessly meritocratic. Mamluks were enslaved as boys, usually Turkic or Circassian captives taken from the steppe or the Caucasus. They were brought to Cairo, converted to Islam, and trained in barracks under the direct control of the Sultan. They learned to ride, to shoot, to fight with lance and sword, and to operate as disciplined cavalry units. They were educated in Islamic law and military theory. They were indoctrinated into loyalty to their regiment and their Sultan. When they completed their training, they were freed and became full members of the military elite. They were given land grants, salaries, and positions of command. They could rise to the highest ranks based on skill and service. They owed everything to the system, and the system demanded everything from them. This was fundamentally different from the feudal armies of Europe or the tribal levies of the steppe. Mamluk soldiers did not fight for family honour or loot, or because their lord commanded it. They fought because war was their profession, and their survival depended on the strength of the state that had created them. They trained constantly. Every Mamluk cavalry unit drilled in formations, archery, and coordinated manoeuvres. They practiced the feigned retreat, the encirclement, the concentrated charge. They studied the tactics of their enemies. They learned from every campaign. By 1260, the Mamluk army was the most disciplined and tactically flexible force in the Islamic world, and they were horse archers, just like the Mongols. This is critical. The Mamluks were not Western knights trying to fight steppe cavalry with heavy armour and lances. They were steppe cavalry themselves, trained in the same tradition, using the same weapons and tactics. The difference was that the Mamluks also fought as heavy cavalry when the situation required it. They wore mail and lamellar armour. They carried lances and swords in addition to their composite bows. They could shoot from horseback, and they could charge home in close combat. They were hybrid cavalry, capable of both missile and shock action. At Ayn Jalut, this flexibility mattered. The Mongols expected the Mamluks to break under arrow fire and harassment, the way every other enemy had. Instead, the Mamluks returned fire, held their formation, and then closed for melee combat where numbers and endurance could decide the outcome. The Mongols were not invincible in close fighting, especially when outnumbered and cut off from their reserves. Baybars understood this. He had fought the Mongols before in smaller skirmishes along the Syrian frontier. He knew they were dangerous, but he also knew they were not invincible. They bled, they tired. They could be flanked and overwhelmed if you refused to play their game. The Mamluk strategy at Ayn Jalut was built on denial. Deny the Mongols the feigned retreat. Deny them the ability to control distance. Deny them room to manoeuvre. Force them into a grinding fight where discipline and numbers could compensate for tactical brilliance. It worked because the Mamluks had the tactical skill to execute it, and the logistical base to sustain it. Qutuz had marched north with supply lines intact, resupplied at Acre, and entered the battle with his army fed and rested. Kitbuqa had marched south from Damascus with what he could carry, and his army was at the end of a long operational reach. When the battle turned against him, he had no reinforcements and no fallback position. After Ayn Jalut, Baybars did not rest. He understood that one victory meant nothing if the Mongols returned in force. He fortified the Syrian frontier with a system of castles, watchtowers, and signal beacons that could relay messages from Damascus to Cairo in less than 48 hours. He rebuilt the cities the Mongols had sacked. He garrisoned them with Mamluk troops rotated from Egypt to prevent local commanders from becoming independent. He also turned his attention to the Crusader states. The Franks had allowed the Mamluk army to pass through their territory in 1260, but Baybars did not trust them. He saw them as potential Mongol allies and a strategic liability. Between 1263 and 1271, he systematically dismantled Crusader power in the Levant. He took Caesarea in 1265, Arsuf in 1265, Safad in 1266, Jaffa in 1268. Antioch, the greatest Crusader city in the east, fell in 1268 after a siege of just 4 days. Baybars allowed his troops to massacre the population. It was a deliberate message, the same kind of terror the Mongols had used. Resist and die. The Crusader states never recovered. Baybars also pursued a diplomatic strategy. He sent embassies to the Mongol Golden Horde, the western branch of the Mongol Empire that controlled the Russian steppes. The Golden Horde was Muslim, and it was hostile to the Ilkhanate in Persia. Over religious and territorial disputes, Baybars offered alliance. The Golden Horde accepted. It was a brilliant move. The Mongol Empire was fracturing along internal lines, and Baybars exploited those fractures to prevent a unified Mongol invasion of Syria. By the time Baybars died in 1277, the Mamluk state was unrecognizable from the fragile regime that had faced the Mongols in 1260. It was a fortified, centralized, and militarily dominant power. It controlled Egypt, Syria, and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. It had destroyed the Crusader states and contained the Mongol threat. It would survive for another 2.5 centuries until the Ottomans conquered Egypt in 1517. But the Mongols did not give up. They returned again and again, and each time the pattern repeated. They invaded, they won battles, they took cities, and then they withdrew, unable to hold what they had conquered. The final major Mongol invasion came in 1303 under the Ilkhan Khazan. He invaded Syria with a massive army, defeated the Mamluks at the Battle of Wadi al-Khazandar, and occupied Damascus. It looked like 1260 in reverse, but the Mamluks regrouped, rebuilt, and counterattacked. They defeated the Mongol garrison at the Battle of Shakab in 1303 and once again drove the Mongols out of Syria. After that, the Mongol Ilkhanates stopped trying. The invasions ended, the border stabilized. The strategic reality had set in. Syria could not be held. The question that haunted Mongol strategists for the next 40 years was simple. Why could they not keep Syria when they had kept everything else? They had held Baghdad. They had held Persia. They had absorbed the cities of Central Asia into a vast administrative system that extracted taxes, raised armies, and governed from the saddle. The Mongol Empire did not just conquer, it occupied and it endured. But Syria kept slipping away. The answer was not a single cause. It was a convergence of geography, logistics, and the structural nature of Mongol administration at the edge of its expansion. Start with the terrain. Syria was not the steppe. The Mongols were at their best on open grassland where their mobility was absolute, and their enemies could be run down over days of pursuit. Syria was broken ground, hills, valleys, coastal mountains, river crossings, and fortified cities. Cavalry armies could operate there, but they could not dominate the way they dominated the plains of Hungary or Persia. The Mamluks knew this. They chose their battlefields carefully and forced the Mongols into terrain that neutralized their primary advantage. Then there was the climate. The Mongol army depended on horses, and horses needed grass. On the steppe, there was always pasture. In Syria, especially in summer, forage was limited. A Mongol army on campaign had to carry feed or move constantly to find grazing. This imposed operational tempo that the Mamluks could exploit. The Mongols could not stay in one place for long without exhausting the land. The Mamluks, supplied from Egypt, could. Water was another constraint. The Mongols had learned to fight in deserts, but Syria was not the Gobi. It was dense with human settlement, agriculture, and cities that controlled the wells and river crossings. To hold Syria, the Mongols needed to garrison those cities and control the roads. That required infantry, siege equipment, and permanent logistics. The Mongol system was built for mobile warfare, not static occupation. And then there was the problem of distance. The Ilkhanate's capital was at Tabriz in northern Persia, more than 600 miles from Damascus. An army marching from Tabriz to Syria crossed deserts, mountains, and the Euphrates. It took weeks. Reinforcements took weeks. Supplies had to be carried or foraged. Every mile stretched the logistics thinner. The Mamluks, by contrast, could move forces from Cairo to Damascus in less than 2 weeks using the coastal road. They controlled the ports of Alexandria, Damietta, and Acre. They could ship supplies by sea and move them overland with pack animals and riverboats. They had strategic depth. The Mongols were at the end of a logistical tether, but logistics alone does not explain everything, because the Mongols had overcome logistical challenges before. They had conquered China, a civilization with fortified cities, massive populations, and terrain far more difficult than Syria. They had adapted. They had used Chinese engineers, built siege engines, and learned to take walled cities. They had incorporated infantry and garrison forces. They had created a hybrid military system that combined steppe mobility with sedentary siege warfare. So why not in Syria? The answer lies in what the Mongols did not control: Egypt. In every other region the Mongols conquered, they controlled the agricultural heartland. When they took northern China, they controlled the Yellow River Basin. When they took Persia, they controlled the grain-producing regions of Azerbaijan and Khuzestan. When they took Transoxiana, They controlled Samarkand and the Fergana Valley. The cities could be starved into submission because the Mongols controlled the countryside. Egypt was different. Egypt was not part of the Syrian frontier. It was a separate, intact, and agriculturally self-sufficient state. The Nile Delta produced enough grain to feed Cairo, the largest city in the Islamic world, and still export surplus. The Mamluks controlled that surplus. They controlled the Red Sea trade routes. They controlled the revenues from pilgrimage to Mecca. They had money, grain, and manpower, and the Mongols could not cut them off. To truly conquer Syria, the Mongols would have had to conquer Egypt, and Egypt was a fortress protected by distance, desert, and the sea. The Sinai Peninsula was a killing ground for steppe cavalry. No grass, no water, no forage. A Mongol army that tried to invade Egypt overland would have starved before it reached the Nile. A seaborne invasion was impossible. The Mongols had no navy. So the Mongols were locked into a strategic paradox. They could invade Syria, but they could not hold it without destroying the Mamluk base in Egypt. And they could not invade Egypt without a logistical and military capability they did not possess. The Mamluks understood this. After Ayn Jalut, every Mamluk sultan fortified Syria not as a permanent frontier, but as a defensive buffer. The real strategic centre was always Egypt. Syria was the shield. Egypt was the fortress. As long as the Mamluks held Egypt, they could always retake Syria. Baybars codified this into doctrine. He built the signal tower network so that news of a Mongol invasion reached Cairo within 2 days. He kept a standing army in Egypt that could mobilize and march north within a week. He stockpiled weapons, horses, and grain in fortified depots along the coastal road. He turned the Mamluk state into a machine designed for rapid response, and he drilled his commanders relentlessly. Mamluk emirs were rotated through Syrian garrisons to learn the terrain. They studied the roads, the water sources, the defensive positions. They practiced forced marches. They rehearsed the logistics of moving 20,000 cavalry from Cairo to Damascus and keeping them supplied in the field. This was not improvisation. This was systematic preparation for a war the Mamluks knew would be fought again and again. And when the Mongols returned in 1281, the system worked. The Mamluk army marched north, met the Mongol invasion at Homs, and defeated them in a single day of battle. The Mongols withdrew. Syria remained Mamluk. By 1300, the pattern was clear to both sides. The Mongols could win battles, they could take cities, but they could not break the Mamluk system because the system was not built around holding ground. It was built around strategic resilience. Lose Syria, retake it. Lose a battle, rebuild the army, trade space for time and time for the logistics to turn against the invader. The Mongol Ilkhanate, meanwhile, was weakening. Hulagu's successors faced internal revolts, succession disputes, and economic strain. The conversion of the Ilkhans to Islam in the early 14th century reduced their ideological unity and alienated their Buddhist and Christian subjects. The empire was fracturing. By 1335, the Ilkhanate had collapsed into rival successor states, and the Mongol threat to Syria ended not with a final battle, but with internal disintegration. The Mamluks had outlasted them, not because they were stronger in any single engagement, but because their system was designed to survive and recover. The Mongols had built an empire of conquest. The Mamluks had built a state of defense, and in the long run, defense backed by logistics and strategic depth proved more durable than the most fearsome army in the world. But there is one more dimension to this, and it is the one that military historians often overlook. The Mamluks did not just build fortifications and supply lines. They built an intelligence network that reached across the entire Near East, and it gave them something the Mongols never had in Syria: advance warning. In every previous Mongol conquest, the targets had been surprised. The Shah of Khwarezm did not believe the Mongols would invade until they were already crossing his borders. The Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad sent defiant messages and failed to prepare until Hulagu's army was at the gates. The Hungarian king received warnings from Polish refugees and ignored them. The Mongols moved faster than information, and by the time their enemies mobilized, the Mongol vanguard was already destroying advance forces and isolating field armies. The Mamluks refused to be surprised. Baybars established a system of spies, informants, and envoys that operated throughout Syria, Anatolia, Persia, and even within the Mongol Ilkhanate itself. Merchants carried messages, Bedouin scouts watched the roads, garrison commanders sent weekly reports. The Mamluk intelligence service was professionalized, funded, and integrated into military planning. When the Mongols began assembling an invasion force in Persia, the Mamluks knew about it weeks before the army marched. They knew the size of the force, the commanders, and the likely route. This allowed them to mobilize early, position forces, and prepare the battlefield. At Ayn Jalut, Qutuz did not stumble into the Mongols. He marched north knowing exactly where Kitbuqa was and how many men he had. The Mamluks chose the time and place of battle, and that choice mattered. Compare this to the Mongol experience in Eastern Europe. When the Mongols invaded Hungary in 1241, King Bela IV had no reliable intelligence. He did not know how large the Mongol force was, where it would cross the Carpathians, or when it would arrive. He mobilized his army and marched east, and the Mongols ambushed him at the Sajo River. The Hungarians were caught divided, encircled, and destroyed. Bela fled, and Hungary was ravaged for 2 years. The Mamluks avoided that fate because they invested in information as heavily as they invested in cavalry. They understood that mobility without intelligence was blind, and blindness against the Mongols was fatal. But intelligence alone was not enough. The Mamluks also changed the way they fought in the decade after Ayn Jalut, and those changes turned them into the most effective anti-Mongol force in the Islamic world. First, they standardized training. Under Baybars, every Mamluk regiment drilled in the same formations and tactics. There was no regional variation, no reliance on the personal preferences of individual commanders. Every unit could coordinate with every other unit because they had trained the same way. This meant that a Mamluk army assembled from garrisons across Egypt and Syria could function as a cohesive force within days, not weeks. Second, they developed combined arms tactics. The Mamluks used horse archers as their primary striking force, but they also employed infantry archers, spearmen, and engineers. When they fortified a position, they used infantry to hold strongpoints while cavalry harassed Mongol flanks. When they besieged a city, they brought siege engines and mining teams. The Mamluks were not a one-dimensional cavalry force. They were a flexible military system that could adapt to different kinds of warfare. Third, they emphasized endurance. Mamluk training included long-forced marches, archery drills that lasted for hours, and cavalry exercises designed to exhaust both horse and rider. The goal was to build an army that could outlast the Mongols in a grinding fight. At Ayn Jalut, the battle lasted most of the day, and by the afternoon both sides were exhausted. The Mamluks won because they had reserves that were still combat effective when the Mongol wings began to falter. Fourth, they controlled the narrative. After Ayn Jalut, Baybars sent letters to every Muslim ruler in the region, proclaiming the Mamluk victory and calling on them to resist the Mongols. He sent official chronicles to Mecca and Medina. He commissioned poets and historians to record the battle as a divine intervention and a turning point in Islamic history. The Mamluks did not just defeat the Mongols militarily. They defeated them psychologically, breaking the aura of Mongol invincibility that had paralyzed resistance for decades. This mattered because the Mongol system relied on terror. Cities surrendered because they believed resistance was hopeless. Armies fled because they believed the Mongols could not be beaten. Ayn Jalut proved otherwise, and that proof spread. After 1260, Mongol invasions faced stiffer resistance. Cities held out longer. Local rulers were less willing to submit. The strategic cost of every Mongol campaign in Syria increased. By the 1280s, the Mongol Ilkhanate had to commit larger forces for longer periods just to achieve the same results they had achieved with smaller forces in 1260. And each time they did, the Mamluks were ready. The intelligence network warned Cairo. The signal towers relayed the alarm. The army mobilized and marched north. The pattern repeated until the Mongols stopped trying. But there was one campaign where the Mongols came closer to breaking the Mamluk system than at any other time. It happened in 1299, and it revealed both the strengths and the vulnerabilities of the Mamluk state. Ghazan Khan, the Ilkhan of Persia, was the most capable Mongol ruler since Hulagu. He had converted to Islam, reformed the Ilkhanate's administration, and rebuilt the Mongol army with a focus on discipline and logistics. He understood why previous invasions of Syria had failed, and he planned accordingly. In late 1299, Ghazan assembled an army of 60,000 men, the largest Mongol force to invade Syria since Hulagu's time. He did not march directly from Persia. He moved slowly, securing supply depots, establishing forward bases, and ensuring his logistics could sustain a prolonged campaign. He crossed the Euphrates in December, defeated a Mamluk advance force at the Battle of Wadi al-Khazandar, and occupied Damascus by January 1300. The Mamluk army had been routed. The Syrian garrisons collapsed. Ghazan controlled Syria, and for the first time since 1260, it looked like the Mongols might hold it. But Ghazan faced the same problem Kitbuqa had faced 40 years earlier. He could take Syria, but could he supply it? His army was enormous, and it was eating through its stockpiles faster than they could be replaced. Forage was scarce in winter. The local population, hostile and resentful, refused to cooperate. The Mamluks had withdrawn to Egypt, but they had not surrendered. They were regrouping. Ghazan held Damascus for 3 months. Then, in April 1300, he withdrew. The official reason was that his army needed rest and resupply. The real reason was that he could not sustain the occupation. His logistics were breaking down, his troops were restless, and the Mamluks were preparing a counteroffensive. The moment Ghazan's army crossed back into Persia, the Mamluks invaded Syria and retook everything. Damascus fell without a fight. The Mongol garrisons left behind to hold the cities were overwhelmed or abandoned their posts. By summer, Syria was Mamluk again. Ghazan tried one more time in 1303. He invaded with another massive army, and once again the Mamluks met him in the field. This time the battle was fought at Marj al-Safa, south of Damascus. It was brutal, confused and indecisive. Both sides claimed victory. But the Mongols withdrew again, and this time Ghazan did not return. He died in 1304, and his successors lacked his strategic vision. The Mongol invasions of Syria ended. The Mamluks had won not through a single decisive battle, but through relentless strategic persistence. The strategic lesson of the Mamluk-Mongol wars was not obvious at the time, and it remains misunderstood today. Most histories frame Ayn Jalut as the decisive moment, the battle that saved Islam and stopped the Mongol tide. That is true in a narrow sense. The Mamluks won, Kitbuqa died, and the Mongols retreated. But the real victory was not won in a single afternoon in 1260. It was won over 4 decades of systematic preparation, adaptation, and strategic endurance. The Mongols lost in Syria because they could not solve a problem that had nothing to do with battlefield tactics. They could not occupy a hostile region at the end of a fragile supply line while facing an enemy with strategic depth, interior lines, and the logistical capacity to outlast them. Every time they invaded, they won battles. Every time they withdrew, the Mamluks retook what had been lost. The Mongols were trapped in a cycle they could not break without committing resources they did not have. To conquer Syria permanently, the Mongols would have needed to do 3 things. First, conquer Egypt and destroy the Mamluk base. Second, establish a permanent garrison system in Syria with fortified supply depots and local administration. Third, maintain that system for years, possibly decades, until local resistance collapsed and Mongol rule became normalized. They could not do the first. Egypt was too far, too well defended, and too difficult to invade with a steppe cavalry army. The Sinai was impassable for large Mongol forces. A coastal invasion would have required a navy the Mongols did not possess. As long as Egypt remained intact, the Mamluks could rebuild and return. They attempted the second after Ghazan's invasion in 1299, and it failed. Mongol garrisons in Damascus, Aleppo and Hama were isolated, undersupplied, and surrounded by hostile populations. When the main Mongol army withdrew, those garrisons were overrun or forced to retreat. The Mongols had neither the manpower nor the administrative infrastructure to hold Syrian cities against sustained Mamluk pressure. The third was impossible without accomplishing the first 2. Occupation requires more than military force. It requires taxation, law, trade, and the cooperation of local elites. The Mongols had achieved this in Persia and Central Asia, but those regions had been conquered completely, and their political structures dismantled. Syria was never fully conquered. The Mamluks always returned, and local populations knew it. Collaborating with the Mongols was suicide. The moment the Mongols left, the Mamluks came back and executed anyone who had cooperated. The Mamluks, by contrast, solved their strategic problem by refusing to solve it the way their enemies expected. They did not try to win a single decisive battle that would end the war. They built a system that could lose battles and survive. They traded space for time, withdrew when necessary, and counterattacked when the enemy's logistics collapsed. They turned the war into a contest of endurance, and they won because their system was designed for exactly that kind of war. This was not a lesson the Mongols learned, because the structure of their empire made it difficult to learn. The Mongol military system was built for conquest, not defense. Mongol generals were rewarded for expansion, for taking new territory and bringing new peoples under the Great Khan's rule. A general who fought a defensive war, who withdrew and regrouped and waited for the enemy to exhaust himself, would have been seen as weak or incompetent. The Mamluks had no such cultural constraint. They were pragmatists. They were former slaves who had seized power through violence and held it through discipline and results. They did not care about honour or reputation in the way a Mongol Khan cared about his lineage and his place in history. They cared about survival, and they did what survival required. After the Mongol threat receded in the early 14th century, the Mamluk state turned its attention to other enemies. They finished the destruction of the Crusader states. Acre, the last major Frankish city, fell in 1291 after a brutal siege. The Mamluks razed the city and massacred the population to ensure it could never be used as a beachhead for another crusade. The Christian presence in the Levant, which had lasted nearly 200 years, ended. The Mamluks also fought internal wars. Succession struggles were constant. Every sultan faced potential coups from ambitious emirs. Baybars himself had taken power by murdering Qutuz. His successors faced the same threats. Between 1260 and 1517, the Mamluk Sultanate had more than 50 sultans. Some ruled for decades, others lasted months. It was a system that rewarded competence and punished weakness, and it produced both brilliance and brutality. But the military system endured. The barracks training, the meritocratic promotion, the centralized command and the logistical infrastructure remained intact through every political upheaval. A new sultan might purge his rivals, but he did not dismantle the army. He could not. The army was the state, and without it, there was no power. This stability allowed the Mamluks to maintain military superiority in the region. For 2.5 centuries, they defeated Crusader invasions, Mongol invasions, and Timurid raids. They controlled the holy cities and the trade routes. They became the dominant power in the eastern Mediterranean and the guardians of Sunni Islam. But the system had weaknesses, and those weaknesses eventually destroyed it. The Mamluk state was built for one kind of war: mobile cavalry warfare against enemies who fought the same way. The Mamluks were superb horse archers and heavy cavalry. They excelled at manoeuvre, at rapid marches, and at battles fought in open terrain. But they were slow to adapt to new military technology. Gunpowder weapons appeared in the Islamic world in the 14th century, brought by the Mongols and developed further by Chinese and Persian engineers. The Mamluks used firearms, but they never integrated them into their tactical doctrine the way the Ottomans did. Mamluk culture valorized the mounted warrior, the archer and lancer who fought in the steppe tradition. Firearms were seen as the weapons of infantry, of commoners, of men who could not afford a horse or master the composite bow. This was a fatal miscalculation. By the early 16th century, the Ottoman Empire had developed a military system built around gunpowder infantry, massed artillery, and disciplined use of firearms in combination with cavalry. The Ottomans did not abandon the traditions of steppe warfare. They incorporated them into a hybrid system that could dominate both open field battles and siege warfare. In 1516, the Ottoman Sultan Selim I invaded Syria with an army that included 12,000 janissaries armed with arquebuses and field artillery. The Mamluks marched north to meet him at the Battle of Majdabik near Aleppo. It was a disaster. The Mamluk cavalry charged the Ottoman lines and were shattered by disciplined volley fire. The Mamluk Sultan was killed. The army disintegrated. Selim marched south, took Damascus, and invaded Egypt. The Mamluks rallied and fought again at the Battle of Rodania, outside Cairo, in January 1517. They lost again. The last Mamluk Sultan, Tuman Bey, was captured and hanged at the gates of Cairo. The Mamluk Sultanate, which had stopped the Mongols and dominated the Near East for 260 years, was destroyed in less than a year. The Ottomans absorbed Egypt and Syria into their empire. They kept the Mamluk military caste as a provincial elite, but the Mamluks never regained political power. The system that had defeated the Mongols could not adapt to the age of gunpowder, and it was swept away by an empire that had learned the lesson the Mamluks had once taught. That war is not about tradition or honour, or the valour of individual warriors. It is about logistics, preparation, and the ability to adapt to the enemy you face. But before the Ottomans arrived, before gunpowder rendered the Mamluk system obsolete, there was a moment in the 14th century when the Mamluks faced an enemy even more terrifying than the Mongols. His name was Timur, and he called himself the sword arm of Islam. Timur was not Mongol by blood, but he was Mongol by culture and military tradition. Born in 1336 in Transoxiana, he claimed descent from Genghis Khan through marriage, though the claim was tenuous. What mattered was that he rebuilt the Mongol war machine at a time when the Mongol Empire had fractured into rival Khanates, and he used it to carve out an empire that stretched from Delhi to Anatolia. Timur conquered with a speed and brutality that rivaled Genghis himself. Between 1370 and 1405, he destroyed the Golden Horde, crushed the Delhi Sultanate, sacked Baghdad, and defeated the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid I in battle. He built pyramids of skulls outside the cities he took. He burned libraries, slaughtered populations, and left deserts where kingdoms had stood. By 1400, he controlled more territory than any ruler since the Mongol conquest of the 13th century. And then he turned his attention to Syria. The Mamluk Sultan at the time was Faraj, a young and inexperienced ruler who had inherited the throne at 13. He was surrounded by ambitious emirs who spent more time plotting against each other than preparing for external threats. The Mamluk state was weakened by internal conflict, and Timur saw an opportunity. In late 1400, Timur invaded Syria from the east. His army was massive, perhaps 80,000 men, and it moved with the same terrifying efficiency that had destroyed every enemy he had faced. He took Aleppo in October 1400 after a brief siege, and then ordered the city sacked. The Mamluk garrison was slaughtered. The population was massacred or enslaved. Timur built a pyramid of 20,000 skulls outside the city walls. Damascus was next. The Mamluk army marched north to defend it, but when they arrived and saw the size of Timur's force, the emirs panicked. Some argued for battle, others argued for retreat. The army was divided, demoralized, and paralyzed by indecision. Timur did not give them time to resolve the debate. He advanced, and the Mamluk army disintegrated. Some units fought. Most fled. The Mamluks retreated to Egypt without ever engaging in a serious battle. Damascus surrendered in January 1401. Timur promised to spare the city if it opened its gates. The population complied. Timur occupied the city, extracted tribute, and then allowed his troops to loot it anyway. The mosques were burned. The scholars were killed or taken as slaves. The Great Umayyad Mosque, one of the holiest sites in Islam, was torched. Damascus, which had survived the Mongol invasions and the Crusader sieges, was destroyed. Timur then withdrew. He did not attempt to conquer Egypt. He did not try to hold Syria. He simply ravaged it and left, turning his attention to Anatolia and the Ottomans. Within a year he was gone, and the Mamluks retook Syria without a fight. It was the same pattern as the Mongol invasions, but with one critical difference. Against the Mongols the Mamluks had fought. Against Timur they had run. The system that had defeated Kitbuqa and outlasted Ghazan had failed completely. Why? The answer was not military. It was political. The Mamluk state in 1400 was not the disciplined, centralized war machine that Baybars had built. It was a fractured regime controlled by competing factions. The emirs commanded their own regiments, controlled their own resources, and owed loyalty to themselves first and the Sultan second. When Timur invaded, the emirs calculated their odds individually. Many decided that fighting Timur was suicide, and they were probably right. Timur's army was larger, more experienced, and led by a general who had never lost a major campaign. So they withdrew, and the Mamluk state survived, but it was humiliated. The lesson was clear. The Mamluk system worked when it was unified, disciplined, and led by a capable sultan. Without those things, it collapsed. The institutions Baybars had built, fortifications, signal towers, supply depots, intelligence networks, meant nothing if the army refused to fight. After Timur's death in 1405, the Mamluks rebuilt. They retook Syria, they restored the fortifications, they reasserted control over the trade routes. But the damage to their reputation was lasting. The Mamluks were no longer seen as invincible. They were seen as survivors, as a state that endured through resilience and geography rather than military dominance. And yet, they did endure. For another century, the Mamluks remained the dominant power in the eastern Mediterranean. They controlled the routes between Europe and Asia. They taxed the spice trade. They extracted revenue from pilgrims travelling to Mecca. They maintained the largest standing cavalry army in the region. But the world was changing. European powers were finding new routes to Asia around the southern tip of Africa. The Portuguese reached India by sea in 1498, bypassing the Mamluk-controlled overland routes. Venetian and Genoese merchants, who had enriched the Mamluks through trade for centuries, shifted their business elsewhere. The revenues that sustained the Mamluk military began to decline. At the same time, gunpowder technology was advancing. The Ottomans built foundries that produced bronze cannons in large numbers. They trained infantry regiments in the use of matchlock firearms. They integrated artillery into field armies and siege trains. The military balance was shifting towards states that could mass-produce gunpowder weapons and deploy them effectively. The Mamluks resisted this shift. There were practical reasons. Firearms required gunpowder, which had to be imported or manufactured. They required gunsmiths and armourers. They required drill and discipline of a kind different from traditional cavalry training. The Mamluks had built an entire culture around mounted archery, and changing that culture would have required dismantling the system that gave them power. There were also ideological reasons. Mamluk identity was tied to the warrior tradition of the steppe. A Mamluk was a man who could ride, shoot, and fight with lance and sword. Firearms were seen as the weapons of peasants, of men who lacked the skill and courage to fight in the old way. To embrace firearms fully would have meant abandoning the identity that made the Mamluks who they were, so they adapted slowly, reluctantly, and incompletely. By 1516 the Mamluk army included gunpowder units, but they were poorly integrated, undervalued, and numerically insufficient. When the Ottomans invaded, the Mamluks discovered that their traditional tactics, mobility, archery, and shock cavalry charges, were obsolete against disciplined infantry with firearms and artillery support. At Majd-Dabik, the Mamluk heavy cavalry charged the Ottoman centre and were cut down by massed arquebus fire. The Mamluk horse archers tried to flank the Ottoman lines and were shelled by field artillery. The Mamluk infantry, what little there was, broke and ran. The battle was over in a few hours. The Mamluks lost not because they lacked courage, but because they were fighting a war with the tactics of a previous century. The same thing happened at Ridania. The Mamluks fortified a position outside Cairo with earthworks and artillery. They had learned from Majd-Dabik and tried to adapt. But the Ottoman artillery was superior, and the Ottoman infantry overwhelmed the Mamluk defences in a coordinated assault. Tuman Bey, the last Mamluk sultan, fought bravely and retreated into Cairo. The Ottomans followed. Tuman Bey was captured, tried, and executed. The Mamluk state ceased to exist. The fall of the Mamluk Sultanate in 1517 closed a chapter that had begun nearly 3 centuries earlier, but the strategic lessons written in that chapter remained. When military historians study the Mamluk-Mongol wars, they often focus on the drama of Ayn Jalut or the tactical details of cavalry combat, but the real story is not about a single battle or a heroic stand. It is about the structural factors that determine whether a state can defend itself over the long term against a superior enemy. The Mamluks succeeded where nearly everyone else failed, because they understood something fundamental about warfare that their enemies either missed or could not act upon. They understood that military power is not just about battlefield effectiveness. It is about sustainability. It is about the ability to absorb defeats, rebuild, and continue fighting until the enemy exhausts his capacity to invade. This principle applied directly to the confrontation with the Mongols. The Mongols won most of the individual battles. They took cities. They killed Mamluk soldiers. But they could not sustain their conquest because their logistical system was built for expansion, not occupation. Every Mongol invasion of Syria was a raid at strategic scale. They came, they fought, they took what they could, and then they left because staying would have required resources they did not have. The Mamluks lost battles, lost cities, and lost territory, but they never lost Egypt, and as long as Egypt remained intact, they could rebuild. The Nile Delta produced the grain. The Red Sea ports brought in the revenue. The barracks in Cairo trained new soldiers. The system replaced losses and continued functioning. Think about that for a moment. The Mamluks were not winning through superior tactics or better generals. They were winning through strategic architecture. They had built a state whose core was geographically defensible and economically self-sufficient. Syria was the frontier, not the foundation. Losing Syria was painful, expensive, and embarrassing, but it was not fatal. Losing Egypt would have been fatal, and the Mongols could never take Egypt. This created a strategic asymmetry. For the Mongols, every invasion of Syria was a gamble. They had to march hundreds of miles, fight a major battle, occupy hostile cities, and then either stay and face logistical collapse or withdraw and watch the Mamluks retake everything. For the Mamluks, every defence of Syria was a calculated risk. If they won, they held the frontier. If they lost, they withdrew to Egypt, waited for the Mongols to leave, and then retook Syria. Over time, the costs accumulated unevenly. The Mongol Ilkhanate spent resources on campaigns that produced no lasting gain. The Mamluks spent resources on a defensive system that worked. Eventually, the Mongols stopped trying, not because they were defeated in a final climactic battle, but because the strategic logic no longer made sense. This is the lesson that applies beyond the 13th century. In any prolonged conflict, the side that can sustain its effort longer wins, even if it loses more battles. The side with strategic depth, interior lines, and a system designed for resilience will outlast the side that depends on conquest to fund the next conquest. The Mongols had built an empire through conquest, and conquest required continuous expansion. When expansion stopped, the system began to fracture. The Ilkhanate faced internal revolts, succession disputes, and economic strain. By the 1330s, it had collapsed. The Mamluks, by contrast, were not dependent on expansion. They controlled trade routes, taxed agricultural production, and maintained a professional army funded by stable revenues. When external threats receded, the state continued. But there is a darker lesson here, one that the Mamluks themselves eventually learned. A system optimized for one kind of war becomes vulnerable when the nature of war changes. The Mamluk state was designed to fight mobile cavalry armies in the Near East. It was built around horse archers, heavy cavalry, and fortified cities. It excelled at rapid mobilization, forced marches, and defensive resilience. Against the Mongols, the Crusaders, and the Ayyubids, this system was unbeatable. Against gunpowder infantry and massed artillery, it was obsolete. The Mamluks saw the Ottomans coming. They knew about Ottoman firearms. They had fought Ottoman skirmishes and border raids for decades, but they did not adapt, because adaptation would have required dismantling the very system that had made them powerful. The barracks training that produced elite horse archers was useless for training musketeers. The culture that valorized mounted warriors resisted the idea that infantry with firearms could dominate a battlefield. The financial system that funded cavalry regiments would have needed restructuring to produce gunpowder and artillery in quantity. In the decades after the Mongol threat faded, the Mamluk Sultanate became the dominant military power in the eastern Mediterranean, and it maintained that position through the same principles that had defeated the Mongols: preparation, discipline, and strategic resilience. But success brought complacency, and complacency created vulnerabilities. By the late 15th century, the Mamluk military system had become a victim of its own success. The training was still rigorous, the soldiers were still professional, but the strategic thinking had calcified. The Mamluks had spent 2 centuries preparing for the same enemy, steppe cavalry armies attacking from the east. They had built fortifications along the Syrian frontier. They had stationed garrisons at key points. They had maintained supply depots and signal networks. The entire system was optimized for one scenario: a Mongol-style invasion from Persia. When the Ottomans invaded in 1516, they came from the north, through Anatolia, and they fought in a way the Mamluks were not prepared for. The Ottoman army was not built around horse archers. It was built around Janissary infantry, armed with arquebuses, supported by provincial cavalry and massed artillery. The Ottomans did not rely on mobility and encirclement. They relied on firepower and disciplined formations. At Marj Dabik, the Mamluk strategy was the same strategy that had worked at Ayn Jalut: draw the enemy into close combat, use cavalry mobility to flank and encircle, break the enemy line with shock charges. It had worked against Kitbuqa. It had worked against the Crusaders. It did not work against the Ottomans. The Mamluk heavy cavalry charged the Ottoman centre and rode directly into massed arquebus fire. Horses screamed and fell, riders were thrown, the charge stalled, disintegrated, and the survivors fell back in disorder. The Mamluk horse archers tried to harass the Ottoman flanks with arrow fire, but Ottoman field artillery shelled their formations and forced them to keep their distance. The Mamluks could not close, could not encircle, and could not force the kind of melee combat where their training gave them an advantage. The battle turned into a grinding firefight, and the Mamluks lost because they had fewer guns, less gunpowder, and no tactical doctrine for fighting in that kind of engagement. By the end of the day, the Mamluk army had broken. The Sultan was dead. The survivors retreated to Egypt, and the Ottomans occupied Syria without serious resistance. The Mamluks tried to learn. At Radania, 3 months later, they fortified a defensive position outside Cairo and brought up their own artillery. They built earthworks. They positioned infantry to support the cavalry. They tried to fight the Ottomans the way the Ottomans fought. But they were learning on the battlefield, and the Ottomans had been perfecting these tactics for decades. The Ottoman artillery was superior. The Ottoman infantry was better drilled. The Ottoman command coordination was tighter. The Mamluks fought hard, but they were outmatched, and Cairo fell. The speed of the collapse was shocking. In less than a year, the Mamluk Sultanate went from regional dominance to total defeat. The state that had stopped the Mongols and outlasted the Crusades was destroyed by an enemy that understood the new realities of 16th century warfare. But here is the thing. The Ottomans did not win because they were braver or more disciplined or better led. They won because they had adapted their military system to the technologies and tactics of their time, and the Mamluks had not. The Ottoman military was a hybrid system. It combined traditional cavalry with modern infantry. It used both bows and firearms. It incorporated engineers, artillery specialists, and logistical planning into a centralized command structure. The Ottomans studied their enemies, learned from defeats, and continuously updated their methods. When they fought the Hungarians, they learned how to counter European heavy cavalry. When they fought the Safavids in Persia, they learned how to fight steppe cavalry. When they fought the Mamluks, they brought lessons from both. The Mamluks, by contrast, had stopped adapting after the Mongol Wars. They had found a system that worked, and they held on to it long after the conditions that made it effective had changed. This is a common failure in military history. The French army in 1940 planned to fight World War I again. The Soviet Union in Afghanistan tried to fight a conventional war against insurgents. The United States in Vietnam applied strategies designed for European battlefields to Southeast Asian jungles. In every case, the failure was not a lack of courage or resources. It was a failure to recognize that the nature of the conflict had changed. The same pattern repeated in 1516. The Mamluks believed their reputation would protect them. They believed the Ottomans, despite their firearms and artillery, could not stand against true warriors trained in the traditions of the steppe. They were wrong, and they paid for that mistake with their independence. But the lessons of the Mamluk-Mongol Wars survived, even if the Mamluks themselves did not internalize them. Other powers studied those wars and drew their own conclusions. The Ottomans learned that gunpowder could neutralize cavalry dominance. They saw what happened when traditional steppe tactics met disciplined infantry with firearms, and they built their entire military system around that insight. The Janissaries became the core of the Ottoman army, and their success validated the strategic shift from cavalry-centric warfare to combined arms. The Safavid dynasty in Persia, which rose to power in the early 16th century, learned the importance of fortifications and strategic depth. They fought the Ottomans for 2 centuries, and like the Mamluks before them, they discovered that holding fortified positions and trading space for time could offset Ottoman firepower advantages. European military theorists, watching from a distance, learned that the age of cavalry was ending. The pike and shot formations that dominated European battlefields in the 16th and 17th centuries were a response to the same technological shift that destroyed the Mamluks. Infantry with firearms, properly drilled and supported by artillery, could defeat cavalry charges. This realization transformed European warfare and eventually spread globally. But the deepest lesson, the one that transcends technology and tactics, is about the nature of strategic competition. The Mamluks defeated the Mongols not by matching their strengths, but by exploiting their weaknesses. The Mongols were mobile, experienced, and tactically brilliant. The Mamluks could not outmaneuver them, could not rely on superior generalship, and could not win through individual valor, so they did not try. Instead, they built a system that turned Mongol strengths into liabilities. Mongol mobility required forage and open terrain. The Mamluks fortified cities and controlled water sources, limiting where the Mongols could operate. Mongol logistics depended on speed and living off the land. The Mamluks prolonged the campaigns and forced the Mongols to either withdraw or starve. Mongol tactical doctrine relied on encirclement and feigned retreats. The Mamluks refused to pursue, held their formations and forced close combat. At every point, the Mamluk strategy was about negation. Deny the enemy his advantages, force him to fight your fight, not his, make the campaign expensive, exhausting, and ultimately unsustainable, win by not losing long enough for the enemy to give up. This is not a glamorous way to win a war. It does not produce moments of heroic triumph or decisive breakthroughs. It produces grinding, attritional struggles where victory looks like survival and success looks like the enemy walking away. But it works. It worked for the Mamluks against the Mongols. It worked for the Vietnamese against the French and the Americans. It worked for the Afghans against the Soviets and later against NATO. It worked for the Finns against the Soviets in the Winter War. In every case, the weaker power survived not by defeating the stronger power in battle, but by making the war too costly to continue. The prerequisite for this kind of strategy is strategic depth. You need a base that the enemy cannot easily reach or destroy. For the Mamluks, that base was Egypt, protected by the Sinai Desert and the Mediterranean. For the Vietnamese, it was the interior and the sanctuaries across the borders in Laos and Cambodia. For the Afghans, it was the mountains and the tribal networks that could disperse and reconstitute indefinitely. Without strategic depth, attritional defense is impossible. You need somewhere to retreat to, somewhere to rebuild, somewhere the enemy cannot follow without overextending himself. The Mamluks had Egypt. The Mongols had nothing comparable in Syria. Every invasion stretched their logistics to the breaking point, and every retreat conceded everything they had gained. The second prerequisite is institutional resilience. The Mamluk state could absorb defeats because its core institutions, the barrack system, the revenue base, the administrative structure, remained intact. A defeat in Syria was painful, but it did not collapse the state. A sultan could be killed, an army could be scattered, and within months the system would produce a new sultan and a new army. This kind of resilience is rare. It requires institutions that are not dependent on individual leaders, that can function through political upheaval, and that prioritize long-term sustainability over short-term glory. The Mamluks built such a system, almost by accident, because their origins as slave soldiers made them distrust hereditary succession and forced them to institutionalize power. The third prerequisite is patience. Attritional strategies take time, years, decades. The Mamluk-Mongol Wars lasted from 1260 to 1303, more than 40 years. The Mamluks had to fight multiple invasions, rebuild after each one, and endure the uncertainty of not knowing when or if the Mongols would stop coming. A state that demands quick victories cannot sustain this kind of effort. The Mamluks could sustain it, because their political culture valued survival over conquest. They were pragmatists, not ideologues. They did not need to defeat the Mongols forever. They only needed to survive long enough for the Mongol threat to recede, and eventually it did. In the centuries since the Mamluk Sultanate fell, the story of Ayn Jalut has been told and retold, often simplified into a tale of Islamic resistance against pagan invaders, of faith triumphing over barbarism, of the underdog defeating the tyrant. That version is comforting, but it misses the point. The Mamluks did not defeat the Mongols through faith or moral superiority. They defeated them through cold, practical calculation. They studied their enemy. They identified structural weaknesses. They built a system designed to exploit those weaknesses. They accepted losses, retreated when necessary, and returned when the conditions favoured them. They turned war into a question of logistics and endurance, and they won because their logistical foundation was stronger. This is not a story about miracles. It is a story about institutions, preparation, and strategic alignment. When Qutuz killed the Mongol envoys in 1260, he was not making a heroic gesture. He was making a calculated decision based on an analysis of Mamluk interests. Submission to the Mongols meant the end of Mamluk power, and probably the end of his life. Resistance meant war, but it was a war the Mamluks had a chance of surviving. He chose survival, and he built a campaign around that choice. When Baybars fortified Syria after Ayn Jalut, he was not celebrating a great victory. He was preparing for the next invasion. He knew the Mongols would return, and he knew the Mamluks had to be ready. The signal towers, the garrisons, the supply depots, the intelligence networks, all of it was built on the assumption that one battle meant nothing and the war would continue for decades. When the Mamluks fought at Homs in 1281 and Marj al-Safar in 1303, they were following the same playbook. Mobilize quickly, force the Mongols into unfavourable terrain, fight defensively, outlast them, wait for their logistics to collapse, retake what was lost, repeat. It worked because the Mamluks understood the war they were fighting. They were not trying to conquer the Mongol Empire. They were trying to make Syria too expensive to hold, and they succeeded. But the story does not end with the Mongols giving up. It ends with the Mamluks failing to apply the same principles when the nature of war changed. Against the Ottomans, the Mamluks forgot the lessons of their own success. They stopped studying their enemy. They stopped adapting. They relied on tradition instead of analysis, and they were destroyed. This is the final lesson, and it is the hardest one. Success in war is not permanent. The methods that work in one era become obsolete in the next. The institutions that bring victory can ossify into obstacles. The reputation earned through past triumphs can become a substitute for present preparation. The Mamluks built a system that defeated the Mongols, and then they became prisoners of that system. They could not imagine fighting any other way, because the way they fought had always worked. Until it didn't. This happens again and again in history. The Roman legions dominated the Mediterranean for centuries, and then they faced enemies who refused to fight set-piece battles, and slowly bled the empire through raids and attritional warfare. The French knights were the finest heavy cavalry in Europe until they met English longbowmen at Crécy, and discovered that peasants with bows could kill armoured nobles. The German army in 1939 pioneered combined arms mechanized warfare and conquered Europe, and then faced the Soviet Union and discovered that operational brilliance meant nothing without the industrial base to sustain it. In every case, the side that lost was not weaker or less brave. They were fighting the last war instead of the current one.